Between 1942 and 1964, 4.8 million people came to the United States from Mexico under the Mexican Farm Labor Supply Program, more commonly known as the Bracero program. Sadly, the experiences of those 4.8 million farm workers, as well as the millions that came before and after them, are not part of the narrative of American history that is told inside most American classrooms. This is their story. The story of the Bracero program is part of a larger history of American economic imperialism in Mexico, a process that began in earnest with the construction of a national railroad network in Mexico in 1877. As a result of this network, thousands of Mexican peasants were displaced from their land and left with little alternative but to seek work in El Norte. As a result, between 1890 and 1929, 1.5 million Mexicans migrated to the United States. The majority of them worked as agricultural laborers in the American Southwest. In spite of the harsh conditions of farm work, the migration continued because of the simple fact that those who participated in the American economy were better off economically than those who didn't. American agribusinesses welcomed this influx of cheap and vulnerable laborers. In 1942, in response to the increased production demands of the American war effort, the Mexican Farm Labor Supply Program was enacted as a temporary program that would ensure a constant supply of cheap labor to U.S. agribusiness. Although informal migration from Mexico to the U.S. had existed since the end of the 19th century, this program formalized that migration. Early on in the program, the Mexican government expressed concern about the rights of its workers. In response, a series of informal amendments were passed between 1943 and 1947 that were intended to protect the rights of the workers. Ezequiel Padilla, Mexico's foreign secretary at the time, praised these amendments, declaring, "The agreements provide an opportunity to earn high wages and a noble adventure for our youth." This noble adventure, Padilla describes, began in processing centers in Mexico set up by the Mexican government. A quota system was used to determine the number of Mexican workers from each state in Mexico who could apply to work in the U.S. The process was competitive because there were so few viable jobs in Mexico. One former worker remembered how many of the applicants to the Bracero program were so poor that they were often forced to search for food in trash cans. Just like the generations before them, the prospect of employment in the North was only appealing because the economic situation in Mexico was so dire. Those who made it through the screening process in Mexico endured extensive physical examinations. Many men who were brought into the U.S. but ultimately not selected were left without any form of transport or aid for the journey back to Mexico. This system of imported labor relied upon a view of Mexican workers that saw them solely for their utility and ignored their humanity. Pablo Siqueiros, a farm worker in Brawley, California in 1960, described himself in an affidavit as an imported farm worker brought in by the Desert Growers Association. His detached and passive tone suggests an alienation from himself as well as the product of his labor. In the imaginations of the growers and the U.S. government, braceros were seen not so much as people, but rather as commodities that should be used to maximize profit. The conditions of the farmworker camps made this clear. Migrants endured harsh working conditions, prejudice, substandard housing, physical mistreatment, exposure to pesticides, inadequate medical care, and substandard food that caused illness. These miseries were made worse by the fact that businesses like the Desert Growers Association regularly refused to account for the hours braceros worked. It was also common practice for the company to withhold wages and issue fake payroll slips. The loyalties of the doctors help explain the inadequate medical care in the camps. Camp doctors were selected not so much because of their identification with the medical profession at a local level, but because they too were a landowner and identified with the big growers. Authorities such as the Department of Labor, who might have enforced the worker protections outlined in the 1942 agreement, often failed to do so because of legislative loopholes and an inadequate operating budget. In the end, though, the ultimate reason that the braceros were exploited was because the program was created to serve the interests of American corporations and the American government. Braceros were merely cogs in the profit-generating machine. There were those, however, who challenged this system, such as Ben Yellen. Yellen was a political activist and physician in Brawley, California, who first learned about the appalling conditions of the Bracero camps when he treated some of the workers for illness. In 1960, he filed a suit against the big growers and the Continental Life Insurance Company for defrauding migrant workers of their medical insurance benefits. It is because of Yellen's activism that the legal testimony of many braceros has been preserved in the Ben Yellen collection. The Bracero program officially ended in 1964. Despite the increased attention that activists such as Cesar Chavez brought to the issue of farm worker rights, the pattern of Mexican migrants working in American fields has not changed much since the beginning of the 20th century. Today, in 2010, 95% of the farm workers in California are of Mexican origin. Over 3/4 of them earn less than $10,000 a year. Are these workers experiencing the same mistreatment in 2010 that the braceros experienced? Who is ensuring that the rights of these workers are protected? Who is ignoring these rights? The issues surrounding agricultural labor and transnational migration are complex. At the same time, however, there are some things that are quite simple, such as the right of all persons to fair working conditions, just treatment, and an effective recourse for redressing grievances. The story of the Bracero program highlights the importance of seeking out the stories of the powerless, listening to them, and then retelling them. These untold stories must inform the work of all those engaged in the struggle for a more just and peaceful world.